If you watched my previous post on unprinted patterns, you will recall that I did not cover McCall, or McCall's as it was later renamed, as they patented the printed pattern in the 1920s. They held on to that patent until the late 1930s, and it took a while for other companies to release printed patterns. Let's look at some of the changes from early printed patterns until the 1970s. Let's start with this McCall special pattern from the 1920s. This pattern is a printo-gravure pattern, which is printed in blue ink on tissue paper and includes seam allowances and pattern markings. The pieces are printed with the fabric layout for cutting the dress, different views offered with the pattern, and instructions on how to sew the pattern. Instructions on how to alter the pattern are also included. My copy of the pattern even included an order form for McCall's magazine in surprisingly good condition. This cut-easy pattern from the 1920s is really interesting. The instruction sheet only shows a few of the actual pieces on the layout, and the sewing guide is extremely short. However, the pattern pieces are very detailed. The pattern also includes 3 sizes, which is extremely unusual. All of the pieces look as if they were hand-lettered on the tissue. However, all pleats as well as specific instructions for each size are included. For this McCall pattern from the 1930s, there is a separate instruction sheet rather than having them printed on the pieces. The pattern is still printed in blue ink, but only the markings are colored, not the pieces themselves. The pattern is just called a printed pattern rather than printo-gravure. The pieces are much more like what we are familiar with. There are detailed instructions for all marks on the pieces, which are translated into French and Spanish as well. This 1930s pattern from Pictorial Review uses perforations in combination with printed markings. Darts, gathering, and seam allowances are marked with perforations, but instructions on what the perforations mean is printed on each pattern piece. The straight grain is marked by a grain line as well as with perforations. All the notches are numbered to aid in construction. Like the McCall's pattern from this period, this pattern also includes French and Spanish piece names. By the 1940s, Simplicity was starting to release printed patterns. This Simplicity pattern still cuts out the notches and marks the seam allowance with perforations, but the straight grain, piece name, and other instructions are printed on the piece. Notches are numbered and specific instructions are also printed on the pieces. On this pattern, only a Spanish translation is included. By the late 1950s, most companies were offering printed patterns, and they had reached the standard that we are more familiar with. Everything was printed on the pattern. Advanced printed patterns were very similar to McCall's, though printed in black ink. Butterick patterns used a thicker line than Advance, but were all printed. An exception was Vogue patterns, which still used some perforations along with the printed guides. Vogue pieces were still cut out separately, and they were only printed in English. After 1967, when the new pattern sizing was introduced, all patterns were printed and used standard markings across brands. They were printed on large sheets of tissue for the user to cut out and included Spanish and French translations. This 1970 pattern has modern sizing and looks like the patterns we are used to. However, it wouldn't be until the 80s that companies introduced patterns with 3 separate sizes. That cut-easy pattern was really innovative. I hope this video has helped you learn more about the history of vintage patterns. One of the great things about vintage patterns is the interesting details they include. I'll be off next week to launch my first new pattern of 2025. but I'll be back the next week to share some of the great details of my 1930s vintage patterns with you. Make sure to subscribe to be notified when the next post comes out. Let me know if you have questions about working with vintage patterns below. And be sure to like if you found this helpful. Thank you.